When I was younger, people thought the automobile represented freedom. That was true for a while. A good machine that helped a person get to work, see family, move goods, and live with a little more independence was a wonderful thing. A practical car, honestly built and sensibly priced, could expand a life. But over time, America made a terrible trade. It stopped building a car market and started building a debt market with wheels attached to it. That distinction matters more than most people understand, because once you grasp it, a lot of what looks confusing suddenly becomes obvious. Why do prices keep rising faster than comfort? Why do monthly payments look more important than total cost? Why do people who appear respectable and financially stable keep getting trapped in loans that outlast the useful life of the asset? Why does a machine that used to symbolize mobility now so often symbolize anxiety? The answer is that the industry no longer lives or dies by whether a customer can comfortably afford a durable product. It lives or dies by whether a borrower can be induced to carry another layer of obligation. A car used to be something a family tried to own. Now it is something the system tries to make sure you keep financing. That change did not happen by accident, and it did not happen overnight. If you go back to the early years of the American automobile, you find a very different instinct. Henry Ford was not a saint, and I have never been interested in turning businessmen into saints. But he understood something elemental. If the people doing the work cannot afford the products they are making, then the prosperity story is hollow. It is unstable. It is bad economics disguised as discipline. He raised wages. He shortened the workday. He thought an industrial system worked best when laborers were participants in growth rather than disposable parts feeding a machine from which they could never benefit. He wanted scale, but he also wanted enough purchasing power in ordinary hands for that scale to mean something. Then another instinct took over. That instinct said the business does not exist to make a solid motor car at a price that preserves room in the customer's life for savings, home building, and dignity. The business exists to maximize financial extraction. It exists to make money first and let the product become the delivery vehicle for that objective. Once that instinct won, the entire logic of the market changed. If your goal is to sell a durable tool, you think about reliability, simplicity, repairability, and lifetime cost. If your goal is to maximize financial extraction, you think about status pressure, repeat turnover, pricing ladders, feature games, financing terms, dealership markups, subscription revenue, data harvesting, insurance linkages, and whatever else can keep the customer paying after he already thinks he has bought the thing. That is the system America has now. People often speak of a possible car market collapse as if it were a sudden storm gathering on the horizon. I see something different. I see the compounding result of a philosophy that has been working against the buyer for a very long time. What people call a collapse is usually just a structure finally revealing its true design. When average new car prices move above levels that would once have seemed absurd for a mass consumer product, when the typical monthly payment approaches a second rent bill, when 7-year loans become normal, when delinquencies climb, when repossessions rise, when negative equity gets rolled from one car into the next, and when even prime borrowers start showing strain, that is not some mystery. That is what happens when you treat transportation less like a utility and more like a permanently refinanceable identity product. A sensible person looks at an automobile and asks one question first: what will this machine cost me in total relative to the freedom it gives me? The system asks a different question: how much future income can be attached to this customer before he says no? Those are not the same question, and the gap between them is where a lot of American financial pain lives. One of the most destructive inventions in modern consumer culture was not the car itself. It was the idea that the car should constantly communicate rank. Once that became embedded, the industry no longer had to rely on necessity alone. It could rely on insecurity. It could rely on comparison. It could rely on the humiliation people feel when they believe an older or cheaper car lowers their social standing. That is a marvelous business. If you are the one collecting the payments, it is a disastrous way for a population to organize its consumption. An economy built on productive aspiration can become stronger over time. An economy built on status anxiety usually becomes more fragile over time because people are not just spending for utility, they are spending to defend identity, they are spending to avoid embarrassment. They are spending because they have been taught that visible consumption is evidence of personal worth. Nothing good comes from that. I have always thought one of the easiest ways to stay rich is to stop trying to look rich. That sounds too simple to be profound, but it happens to be true. When people buy symbols in order to impress others, they usually surrender the one thing that could actually improve their future, which is retained capital. The car market has spent decades training Americans to do exactly that. Trade in early, upgrade often. Stretch the term, ignore the total cost. Roll the old balance forward. Focus on the monthly number. Add the insurance. Add the service package. Add the taxes and fees. Add the subscriptions. Add the fuel. Add the repair risk after the warranty. Add the opportunity cost of all the money that will never be invested, because it is being fed to a depreciating machine, and the financial architecture built around it. That is how an ordinary household slowly becomes a servant to an object it was told would liberate it. There is another layer to this that makes the problem worse. America did not just make cars expensive. It built large parts of life around needing one. That was an extraordinary decision. If a product is optional, households can walk away when it becomes too expensive. If a product is effectively mandatory for work, childcare, groceries, medical visits, and social participation, then the seller has a much stronger hand. That is what happened. The physical design of the country drifted further and further toward car dependence. Commuting stretched. Urban cores gave way to sprawl. Public transportation in many places never developed properly or was allowed to deteriorate. Distance became normal. A machine that once expanded freedom became, for millions, the admission ticket just to function. That changes the psychology of the purchase completely. A family is no longer deciding whether a car would improve its lifestyle. It is deciding whether one adult can keep a job, whether the children can get where they need to go, whether the household can live where it can afford housing, whether the person with a medical condition can make appointments, whether late fees and missed shifts start cascading through the rest of life. Once necessity is that high, exploitation gets easier. You can raise prices, you can lengthen loans, you can keep emphasizing the monthly figure, you can sell to weaker credit profiles because demand is not really discretionary in the old sense. You can let dealers and lenders build a thicker layer of fees around the transaction. You can even turn the used car market into a chain of negative equity traps because the borrower often has no elegant exit. He needs transportation now, not after a year of patient repair work on the balance sheet. That is why I say America is not mainly selling cars. It is selling access to basic participation in society through a debt instrument. From a purely financial standpoint, that should worry anyone. Whenever a society turns a necessity into a financing engine, there will be strong pressure to overextend the customer. If the item is also depreciating, if maintenance and insurance costs are rising, if fuel prices can jump for reasons totally unrelated to the buyer's own behavior, and if a recession can threaten income at the exact moment obligations are fixed, then you have all the ingredients for broad household fragility. That is exactly what I see in this market. People talk about the record size of auto loan balances and they should. They talk about the share of borrowers with huge monthly payments, and they should. They talk about 84-month loans becoming common, and they should. They talk about the packaging of weaker credit into securities, and they should. But I think the deepest issue is simpler than anyone's statistic. The market has become detached from the idea of affordability and attached instead to the idea of payment capacity. That sounds like a technical difference, but it is the whole game. Affordability asks whether the purchase leaves room for life after the purchase. Payment capacity asks only whether the borrower can make the current obligation for now. If you lend by the second standard long enough, you can generate a very large market that looks healthy right until the moment a shock arrives, and then all at once it turns out the customer was not comfortable. He was merely stretched. That distinction is always revealed late. Negative equity is one of the clearest signs of a diseased structure. A healthy purchase does not leave the buyer underwater so easily, and so often that the solution becomes shoving old debt into a new loan on another depreciating asset. That is not mobility. That is balance sheet quicksand. Once a person is underwater, behavior changes. He is no longer shopping from strength. He is shopping from constraint. He is no longer asking what transportation makes sense. He is asking what transaction can absorb yesterday's mistake. That puts the dealer, the lender, and the broader financing chain in a stronger position than the customer. It also increases the odds that the next car will not solve the problem. It will extend it. If you want a good mental model, imagine a man standing in a hole and being sold a shinier shovel on slightly revised terms. For a while, it can feel like movement. It is not movement. It is deeper entrapment. Another thing that strikes me is how effectively the industry learned to monetize after the sale. Heated seats become a software toggle. Extra performance becomes a digital unlock. Convenience becomes a feature subscription. Data becomes a side business. Driving behavior becomes something that can be measured, bundled, transmitted, and potentially used against the same customer who thought he was simply operating his own machine. A person buys the car. Then he discovers he has not really bought the full experience of the car. He has bought access to a platform that can continue charging him. Worse than that, he may have bought a rolling data collection device attached to an insurance pipeline. This is what happens when industries discover that ownership can be hollowed out while still being sold under the old emotional language of freedom and independence. The language stays the same. The economic reality underneath it changes completely. I have said for years that the most dangerous costs are often the ones that become normalized before people recognize them as abnormal. A $400 surprise feels outrageous because it is visible. An extra $50 here, $90 there, a subscription you stop noticing, higher insurance tied to monitored behavior, a larger fuel bill, a repair charge on an over-engineered feature. All of that gets absorbed into the background. Yet those background costs can quietly devour an extraordinary amount of capital. The car market is now full of background extraction. That is one reason the pain spreads even to households that do not think of themselves as reckless borrowers. You do not have to be foolish to get hurt in a system designed to pull from every angle. You only have to live in it. I also think people underestimate the moral and social dimension of this problem. A lot of ordinary Americans feel deep shame around money, and much of that shame has been carefully manufactured. They are told that the car in the driveway says something about whether they are succeeding. They are told that visible age or modesty reflects personal failure. They are trained to compare themselves against surfaces. The result is predictable. A young person drives an older car and gets mocked. A worker brings lunch and gets mocked. A frugal family resists upgrading and gets treated as if it lacks ambition. Then the same culture turns around and asks why households are over-leveraged. That question answers itself. When a society glamorizes display and trivializes prudence, overextension becomes easier to sell and harder to resist. I pay close attention to social incentives because they often tell you more than official speeches do. When communities admire the finance symbol more than the paid-for utility, they are telling you exactly which habits are being rewarded. They are not rewarding sound capital allocation. They are rewarding theater. The astonishing thing is that the theater often fools people who should know better. Workers inside banks, dealerships, financial offices, and white-collar workplaces are not immune. Many of them are swimming in the same status game, carrying large car payments, and making assumptions about wealth based on appearance. In my experience, that is backward. The person quietly driving a practical paid-for car often has a sturdier financial future than the person displaying a larger payment stream in the parking lot. That truth offends consumer culture, because consumer culture depends on the reverse illusion. Now I want to speak about quality, because people often assume the pain would be tolerable if the product itself were improving in proportion. Sometimes it is. Often it is not. When producers and financial intermediaries discover they can maintain volume through credit, they do not feel the same pressure to keep the product simple, affordable, and repair-friendly. Complexity can become a feature. Constant refreshes can become a strategy. The buyer is no longer just choosing a machine. He is entering an ecosystem of financing, software, maintenance, surveillance, and replacement. That ecosystem has one central purpose: keep the money moving. If all of this were happening during a period of abundant savings, strong wage growth relative to living costs, and moderate energy prices, the cracks might stay hidden longer. But households are not entering this environment from a position of great resilience. Many are already one unpleasant surprise away from stress. A modest spike in fuel prices matters, a jump in insurance matters, a lost shift matters, a broken transmission matters, a few $100s matters. So when geopolitical conflict threatens oil flows and gasoline rises, the effect is not confined to the pump. It spreads through commuting costs, shipping costs, parts costs, dealer pricing, inflation expectations, and household psychology. An economy already built on rotating debt becomes even more brittle. That is why I do not dismiss the possibility of major strain in the car market. Not because I think all borrowing is evil, not because every borrower is irresponsible, not because every manufacturer or dealer is malicious. I worry because the entire structure has very little margin for error. At the customer level, a system can look durable for years when the people inside it keep sacrificing somewhere else to hold it together. They skip savings, they postpone maintenance on the home, they avoid the dentist, they cut retirement contributions, they carry credit card balances, they delay having children, they work more hours, they live farther out and burn more time. They normalize stress from the outside, the loan still performs. From the inside, the household is quietly deteriorating. That is what makes these systems deceptive. The balance sheet of the lender may not immediately reveal the exhaustion of the borrower's life. I have always believed that the most important measure of any economic arrangement is not the elegance of the spreadsheet, but the lived consequences for the people inside it. By that standard, the modern American car market is sending a loud signal. The signal is that too many people are being asked to carry too much cost for too little real autonomy. Autonomy is the word I care about. A good financial life increases autonomy. A bad one reduces it. A sensible car purchase should increase autonomy by giving a person reliable transportation at a cost that still leaves room for saving, investing, and breathing. An insane car purchase does the opposite. It narrows choices. It hardens monthly obligations. It increases dependence on uninterrupted income. It leaves less room to pivot careers, less room to take a chance, less room to walk away from a bad boss, less room to weather a health issue, less room to invest in anything productive. That is why the car market matters far beyond transportation. It reaches into labor, family stability, geography, time allocation, and the ability of a person to build capital over decades. When I look at a person's future, I do not just ask what he earns. I ask what claims have already been placed on that earning power. A huge car payment is a claim. Expensive insurance is a claim. Fuel dependency is a claim. Repeated turnover due to status pressure is a claim. Negative equity rolled forward is a claim. Subscription creep is a claim. All of these claims stand between the worker and his own future compounding. People sometimes think compounding is only about what you invest. That is only half true. Compounding is also about what you keep losing. A household that avoids one unnecessary $800 monthly burden has not merely saved $800. It has preserved optionality. It has preserved future investment. It has preserved emotional bandwidth. It has preserved the ability to say no to the next trap. That preservation compounds. The opposite compounds too. Then tolerates fuel spikes, then rolls negative equity into the next purchase, then stretches terms further, then finances the next repair or credit card bill, is not just spending, it is building a compounding machine in reverse. That reverse compounding is ruining far more lives than most market commentators want to admit. And yet, I want to be fair. There are people who desperately need a car because the country was built in a way that leaves them little choice. They are not reckless. They are cornered. They do not need lectures. They need alternatives, better pricing, better public systems, more honest products, and an economy that does not force basic mobility through predatory structures. I never confuse exploitation with moral failure on the part of the exploited. At the same time, there is another group of buyers who are not cornered to the same degree. They are pushed by prestige, comparison, and habit. That group has more room to act. It can resist the script. It can stop treating rapid turnover as normal. It can stop worshiping visible consumption. It can stop handing over future years just to satisfy present image. The difficult part is that the culture fights you when you do this. Culture always fights people who opt out of theater. Drive the older car and someone thinks you are behind. Pack lunch and someone thinks you are small. Wear the same coat for years and someone thinks you lack taste. Ignore that. Much of modern prosperity theater is financed weakness, disguised as success. Real strength is quieter. Real strength is the paid-for machine that gets the job done while cash accumulates elsewhere. Real strength is the person who can walk away from a bad deal because he has room. Real strength is the family that does not let a driveway ornament dictate the rest of its balance sheet. Real strength is understanding that a car is supposed to serve your life, not become the center of it. I also think we need intellectual honesty about what kind of collapse people are really talking about. Markets do not always explode in a cinematic way. Sometimes they decay. Sometimes they grind. Sometimes they trap households for years before the official statistics look alarming enough to make headlines. Sometimes the collapse is not the disappearance of sales. It is the disappearance of economic breathing room across millions of families. In that sense, I would argue a large part of the damage is already here. If a product central to working life now routinely requires financing structures that would once have seemed absurd, if the buyer base increasingly depends on weak credit extensions, if delinquencies are rising, if repossessions are climbing, if energy shocks can push already strained budgets over the edge, if producers keep adding extractive layers after the sale, and if the surrounding culture keeps shaming people into overspending, then the issue is not whether something is wrong. Something is wrong. The only remaining question is how visible it must become before the broader public admits what the structure has become. When I evaluate a business, I want to know whether it creates genuine value or whether it merely sits in a strategic position from which it can extract economic rent. More and more of the modern car ecosystem looks to me like rent extraction layered onto necessity that can be profitable for a while. But it does not create a healthy society. It creates resentment, fragility, and eventually political and financial backlash. That brings me to the final point, which is the one I care about most. You do not have to fix the entire system tomorrow in order to protect yourself from some of its logic. You can reject the idea that the car in your driveway measures your worth. You can refuse to call a huge payment normal just because many people have accepted it. You can calculate total cost instead of monthly cosmetics. You can keep a functioning vehicle longer if the economics justify it. You can admire paid-off transportation more than polished debt. You can teach your children that appearances lie. You can stop confusing finance display with wealth. You can remember that every dollar not tied to a depreciating machine has a chance to become something else. An emergency reserve, a share of a wonderful business, a cushion that gives you courage, a future that belongs to you. That is the proper order tools. First, image. Second, function first. Ego second. Freedom first, show second. The tragedy of the American car market is that this order has been reversed for a long time. It now asks millions of people to surrender freedom in order to purchase the image of freedom. It asks them to mortgage future choices for present symbolism. It asks them to confuse access to debt with access to prosperity. I would not call that intelligent capitalism. I would call it a very expensive misunderstanding. And like most expensive misunderstandings, it can persist longer than people expect, because so many interests are paid to keep it alive. Manufacturers need volume, dealers need financing income and fee structures. Lenders need origination, investors need product, software systems need subscriptions, data brokers need streams, insurers need signals, politicians want growth statistics, local economies want sales activity. Consumers want the emotional relief of feeling included. That is a powerful coalition, but no coalition can permanently outrun arithmetic. If the machine requires ever more borrowing, ever longer terms, ever greater dependence on necessity, ever more after-sale extraction, and ever tighter household budgets to sustain itself, then the long-term outcome is not mystery. It is pressure on wages, pressure on savings, pressure on family formation, pressure on mobility in the truest sense, pressure on the credibility of the whole arrangement. The way out begins with clear thinking. See the car for what it is. A machine useful, sometimes necessary, sometimes even enjoyable, but still a machine. It is not your identity. It is not your rank. It is not proof of your virtue. It is not worth forfeiting your future for. I have never known a person to become truly prosperous by making himself easier to extract from. Prosperity comes from owning productive assets, controlling fixed costs, preserving optionality, and living in a way that lets good decisions accumulate. The car market, as currently constructed, fights that logic at every turn. That is why I would be careful, not fearful, careful. Careful about what you finance, careful about what story you are being sold, careful about the difference between transportation and theater, careful about any system that tells you a larger payment is the price of belonging, and especially careful any time a society starts calling debt-based participation the same thing as prosperity. Those two things are not the same. They have never been the same. And the longer people confuse, the more painful the correction tends to be.